All right, everyone. Welcome to the Stoa. I'm nervous for this one. I don't know why. I got kind of like a jittery energy. But we have a special session today called Wisdom Signaling and the Wisdom of Criticism. And we have four guests. And you can say that the guests fall into two teams. Over here, we got Team Wisdom with John Vervaeke, a cognitive scientist from the University of Toronto, known for his popular YouTube series, Awakening from the Meaning Crisis and After Socrates, and his friend of virtue and frequent co-author, Chris Mastropietro. And then over here, we got Team Criticism, the gentleman from the Decoding the Gurus podcast, Chris Kavanagh and Matt Browne. Chris is a cognitive anthropologist and social psychologist from the University of Oxford, and Matt is a psychologist at Central Queensland University. And I'm just going to be letting people in while I talk. Chris came to the Stoa before, and he had a good presentation on what Matt and him called secular gurus. And I suggested to Chris before the session that the archetype of the secular guru engages in what some call wisdom signaling, which is a riff on virtue signaling. So say someone says something that seems wise, and the content what they share may or may not be wise, but the intent is coming from an egoic and narcissistic attention-seeking place. So hence why the title wisdom signaling is in today's title. And I have no idea how today's session is going to go. It could go super awkward. And if that happens, you can totally blame me for it, because I thought this would be an interesting conversation. I follow both Team Wisdom and Team Criticism. I follow both their work. And I do not have a strong sense on how Wisdom plays a role in Team Criticism's worldview, and vice versa. I don't have a strong sense of how Criticism plays a role in Team Wisdom's worldview. And I thought this pairing might reveal any blind spots or simply reveal sides that haven't been expressed due to their focus being elsewhere. So that's the framing on my end. We're going to jump in now. So if everyone can turn off their cameras except today's speakers, it's going to help with the recording when I post it, and it creates a sense of heightened intimacy. And so there's going to be a question. This is how today's going to work. I'm going to pop the question in the chat. And if you just arrived, if you can turn off your camera just for the guests who will have the camera on today. So the question is, what's the importance of wisdom and public criticism? What's the importance of wisdom and public criticism? And then the order, so each person is going to share about 5 minutes each, answer the question. Chris K will start, and then you'll take in John, and then Matt, and then Chris M. So Chris, when you go first, just when you finish, just take in John, and then John takes in Matt, and Matt takes in Chris. And Chris Mastropietro, when you're finished, just seed the conversation with whatever, and then it will be a free flowing, free associative conversation for about 30-45 minutes that we're used to here at the Stoa. And then I'll jump back in maybe 5-10 minutes after the hour. And then we'll have a Q&A for about 20 minutes. So if you have questions anytime, pop it in the chat. I'll call on you. You can ask your question to the panel. If you don't want to be on YouTube, just indicate that in the chat and I'll read your question on your behalf. So that being said, I'm going to highlight each speaker's screen, and Chris K, welcome back to the Stoa, and you are up.
Oh, okay. Thanks, Peter, and good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, whatever applies. I'm going to start a little timer to try and keep myself from doing that academic thing of over talking. Okay, so first thing, I'm glad I got the question right. What's the importance of wisdom and public criticism? So that's a good start. And like a good academic or a good undergraduate student, I looked up the definition of wisdom, and one of the first ones I saw was the ability to use your knowledge and experience to make good decisions and judgments. So that seems a reasonable enough definition for me to work from. So the first point I'd want to make is that most people considered wise, including famous historical religious figures or philosophers, have been harsh critics. The Buddha, along with other leaders of the Sramana movements at the time, was critical of Vedic orthodoxy. Jesus came to teach the New Testament and was famously at odds with the scribes and the Pharisees of his day. Philosophers and theologians since time immemorial spend their time debating with each other and explaining why they're all so terribly wrong. So I think it should be clear that criticism isn't an optional extra when concerning things like trying to develop wisdom. It's a fundamental component of distilling valuable information and practical knowledge. Our podcast doesn't claim to be a philosophy podcast or scientific endeavor, but what it is and what we generally advocate for is the application of critical scrutiny that recognizes bad logic, fallacious reasoning, or the use of highly rhetorical arguments. Similarly, relying on complex jargon or metaphor-filled soliloquies to express simple points. So many of the figures that we cover in the kind of secular guru space are also extremely critical followers of academia, of institutions, but incredibly reactive to any criticism directed at them. It wouldn't be unfair to say they often wallow in grievance and generate persecution narratives that are hard to parody in terms of the narcissistic self-regard that they involve. So what I'm advocating for is not some highly targeted and specific set of standards for heterodox thinkers, sense makers, or secular gurus, but that we apply consistent standards of criticism across domains. Similarly, it's often claimed we're now in a unique period of meaning crisis, that our modern age has robbed people of genuine engagement in spirituality. People are disconnected and atomized. And I want to point out that this narrative is absolutely not novel. It's a recurrent theme throughout history, recycles through the centuries, through the decades. We have the New Thought movement, the Theosophists, the hippies in the age of Aquarius, the Reformation, if you want to go further back, or the wave of Sramana movements, like I said, with the Buddha. So an interest in metaphysical and mystical or esoteric knowledge, and a fascination with guru figures who are linguistically fluid and proficient with metaphors isn't something new. It's a human constant. And just to be clear, myself, and I think Matt as well, have no issue with people who are interested in theology, philosophy, or even religious apologetics. To each their own, let a thousand flowers bloom and all that. Our objection comes when these approaches are misrepresented, make truth claims that can't be supported, and provide people with bad epistemic standards or logical habits. Jordan Peterson haranguing everyone that you actually have to be religious to do science because you believe in a higher concept of truth. It's bog standard religious sophistry. And it's him that links his philosophical insights to advocacy for political partisan positions and climate change contrarianism. Similarly, it's Brett Weinstein and Heller Haying who claim that the appropriate application of a scientific and evolutionarily informed approach leads to anti-vaccine advocacy and the promotion of ivermectin as a near perfect prophylactic treatment to COVID. Or if you want an example which is a bit closer to home, Jonathan Pajot explaining to me that it's impossible to deny that supernatural witches exist because there are self-identified Wiccans. That's religious sophistry. So to return to my main point, it's not that people should be prevented from having reflective arguments or discussions, wrestling with their religious convictions, or even having indulgent conversations about whatever they want. My argument is more that the sense-making, heterodox sphere, whatever you want to talk about it, is very selective about what it focuses on. And it tends to prioritize mutual praise and politeness while ignoring genuine criticism or framing it as being part of the asking the wrong question or bad faith engagement. And so I guess my fundamental argument is that the modern age is not lacking for sources claiming to offer wisdom and getting large followings for it, but rather that such figures and their communities tend to eschew engagement with critical reflection and debate. So yeah, that criticism is a fundamental part of wisdom. And with that, I'll hand to John.
Thank you, Chris. So for me, I think the relationship is mediated by a notion of, which I think was implicit in what Chris was saying, of rationality. And this to me is the capacity for making use of reliable practices, techniques, skills, etc., for overcoming self-deception, whether individually or in groups. And of course, that means that criticism is a central thing. Now, of course, part of what should at times be criticized are those very same rational standards. I think this is going on right now. There's a lot of, we're in sort of what's called the third or fourth rationality debate. And I think this is very important, that we also step back and make sure we are being as reflectively aware of the rational normativity, rational standards, rational principles, whatever noun you want to use, that's at work. And then I put it to you that once we do this, we start to broaden the very notion of rationality beyond just being an inferential propositional thing. I was fortunate to participate in a paper in which we gathered all of the people, psychologists, neuroscientists, cognitive scientists, etc., who have are academically, scientifically studying the nature of wisdom, and cross-culturally too. And we tried to forge out a consensus beyond sort of a dictionary definition, and perspectival metacognitive abilities were central. The ability to take perspectives, to generate insight, etc. It's crucial to overcoming self-deception. And so I think the notion of wisdom overlaps with the notion of rationality when we take rationality to not just be the application of standards of good argumentation. It should not exclude those, but it should not be reduced to them. Once we expand it beyond that, and we start to take note of the kinds of attentional practices, we can ask reasonable questions like, is mindfulness contributory to rationality? Because there are many ways in which we self-deceive because of attentional processes as opposed to inferential processes. And as you broaden the notion of rationality, and this is what I've explicitly argued and published on, you start to overlap with the notion of wisdom as a much more comprehensive attempt to engage in individual and collective self-correction. So if we are broadening the notion of critique to be beyond, but not, again, I want to emphasize, I've never said excluding. I'm a scientist. You know, the good use of evidence, the proper marshaling of argument, the proper engagement in debate. But if we broaden it, then I think the notion of critique, because if it's dependent on standards of rationality, immediately emerges with something like wisdom. And I think in that way, I'm agreeing with Chris, but I might be disagreeing about what is meant by the degree to which that self-criticism should be applied. I think the standard notions of rationality, which we've inherited from the Enlightenment, are too truncated. Both the analytic and the continental traditions have, within philosophy, have sort of come to very paradoxical conclusions about the very status of the norms and the standards they're using. And so I think one of the things that has to be done very carefully is to be able to call those standards into rational reflection and discussion without giving into or giving way to the kind of thing that Chris has warned about. I agree with him that there are lots of people that are espousing bullshit. There are lots of people that are pretending and signaling. I'm very critical of that. I try to be very critical of that in a lot of my work. And so I suppose maybe what I'm suggesting is we might have a bit more common ground between us if we were prepared to broaden the notion of critique beyond sort of a standard Enlightenment notion into the kinds of critiques that are now very prevalent now about rationality per se. I mean, for example, in the first rationality debate, it's been largely recognized that sort of standard logical models of rationality are insufficient because if people would try to be comprehensively rational, comprehensively logical, they would engage in a kind of cognitive suicide. So this means human beings have to rely on heuristics, but heuristics are necessarily biasing. How do we understand rationality? Cherniak made this argument very well in the 80s. He said we can't hold people to be responsible for all the implications of their statements or all the contradictions they might possess. But that doesn't mean we allow them to arbitrarily choose which implications or contradictions they bring up for assessment and self-correction. So the difficulty is, what is the notion of rationality when it's neither algorithmic nor arbitrary? What is it? And this has to do with something that I do a lot of work on, is we hold people responsible, this is the normative standard we actually use, that they have to draw the relevant implications. They have to notice the relevant contradictions. And then trying to understand what that relevance realization process has been central to my work. And so I'm proposing, and that's just one example, that we need to broaden the notion of rationality that integrates, or at least mediates, between critique and wisdom. And that I think is something important that is happening right now. Now, about the perennial stuff, I agree that there, and we even talk about it in our book, Chris, the book that Chris and I wrote, there have been other periods like this in history. And I don't deny that. I don't want to also ignore that there are important differences that we're facing right now. We are facing the probable advent of artificial general intelligence, and that has a capacity to have an impact on our self-understanding and self-interpretation that I think would be possibly in excess of what the printing press did and things like that. So my two main points, just to recap, I think the notion of critique is ultimately bound to a normative notion of rationality. And then if we properly expand that by exposing that to a kind of self-critique, it overlaps with the notion of wisdom that can be properly and is being scientifically studied. And that while the perennial pursuit of wisdom, in meaning, I don't deny that, I think there are perennial problems that human beings are always facing around self-deception. I think there are also important differences happening right now that are historically significant and might make this a different time. And of course, like I said, social media, AGI, AI, and they're all interwoven, I think do make a difference in important ways. And I think that's my time. Pass it off to Matthew.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, it's interesting. While I was listening to your reply to Chris, I was struck by how the four of us come from very different backgrounds. As Chris said, we are not ideologically opposed to philosophy or poetry or or spirituality. I mean, perhaps we are to some degree, but we also recognize that it's partly a matter of taste and it's partly a matter of our training and our backgrounds. So in terms of myself, my career has been pretty varied. I was actually working on computational methods, artificial neural networks, in fact, LeCun's deep learning networks, almost 15, 20 years ago for a while in a robotics laboratory. Worked most of my career in empirical psychology and statistics, and that's given me something of a button-down kind of approach to these kinds of things. I reviewed some of your articles on wisdom, and I also reflected that despite being in psychology for 2 decades now, I'd never really come across the word as a topic of study. And I saw from looking into it that yes, there is indeed a niche there in terms of looking at wisdom. And it's, reasonably fair. That talks about things like intellectual humility, compromise, recognition of uncertainty and change, etc. But I think ultimately, I mean, one of the things psychology is very much guilty of is coming up with trying to measure, trying to figure out any trait that you can name. All right. So in any word that we have in the English dictionary that there's a folk understanding of, we sort of have a shot at measuring this thing, trying to figure out what its properties are, and so on. But one of the things that we've learned is that just because a word exists and has a folk understanding to it doesn't necessarily mean it's particularly coherent or it has some sort of basis in reality, and we should be careful not to reify things. And I'm a little bit concerned that this word wisdom that we've got is, you know, it's kind of equivalent to saying je ne sais quoi. They've got a certain something about them. They're cool, they're hip. You know, these are all words too. And if we wanted to, we could spend a bunch of time figuring out all of the aspects and the things that it's related to and how people view it and what's good about it and what's bad about it. But if we're not careful, these things can turn into word games. So this betrays, I guess, getting back to our difference in perspective. Chris and I come from a scientific background, and our first concerns are, can we measure it? How is this concept necessary in terms of explaining things that are currently unexplained? I teach cognitive neurophysiology, and there's no mention of wisdom in any of the textbooks that I work from. We talk about things like executive processes, various types of memory, motor planning, things like that, but it's actually not a concept that we currently need in order to work with the brain, understand the brain. So, you know, me and Chris, as you said, are more interested in how this concept plays out in society and in the public consciousness. And it seems to me that there's a huge amount of interest in getting other people to perceive you as somebody who's wise. Yeah, I mean, like, are any of us brave enough to call ourselves wise? And but you know, we would quite like it if people thought we were wise. Just like I'd quite like it if people thought I was handsome or cool or funny or groovy. So in terms of how it plays out in the discourse in society, I think that there's a lot of people out there who have natural existential concerns, normal existential worries that are kind of timeless, as Chris mentioned. And there is a market for people to present themselves as wise, to be dispensing wisdom, and to try to allay some of those sort of anxieties, fears, and aspirations that people have. So I guess when me and Chris look at it, we're not really looking at it in a technical sense, in a philosophical sense, or even in a scientific sense, really. But what we're doing is we're looking in terms of how it plays out in society. And as Chris said, there's forever and ever, there's been a market for people to present themselves as shamans, in touch with hidden forces, in touch with the deeper understanding of reality, and with special truths that are hard to understand and difficult to get to. So I just think we should be a little bit careful when we're dealing with this concept to make sure that it's not getting misused. That's my time, I think. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you, gents. I'm going to try and be brief to get us into the dialogue portion as quickly as I can. There's a lot of very persuasive thoughts from all three of you. I guess I'm a little bit more concerned about zooming out a little bit and asking a broader question. I like this question about how wisdom. It seems to me that this question of wisdom criticism and the importance of it is so like intuitive, I think, that I almost don't feel the need to argue for it. Like, clearly, like, I take Chris's point that wisdom criticism is a fundamental part of wisdom, and that it somehow needs to be folded into the project, that it's an aspect of the project. And if the project doesn't include it, then the project's failed. That's something wrong from the beginning. So, like, I think that's so true, and it's so evidently true. I find nothing to dispute about. And I think maybe then the question is, well, if there's this strange, ambiguous category that wisdom is finding itself in? It's not the dissemination of knowledge. It's not the teaching of information. Like, what is it? And if there's a special kind of criticism that applies to wisdom, it probably has something to do with the special kind of thing wisdom is. And maybe we don't believe that there is properly a category for that. But if there is, what would it be? What would it mean? And then understanding what's special about that category, I think, has something to do with understanding how wisdom critique can be wise. Because if there's a critique made of wisdom, it seems to me that the critique would have to be wise. There would have to be something wise about the mode of criticism if it was part of the project. And I wonder if that means that there's some that we have to differentiate it from other kinds of criticism, right? So criticizing or critiquing an argument, a logical argument, you can kind of do that dispassionately, and you can kind of separate that out from whatever you feel is motivating the argument, right? Like you might know the person who's making an argument, and you might think that their motives are corrupted, but you can kind of look at the argument and you can appraise it on its own merit, and you can check if it's sound or if it's valid or if it follows. And you can do that, and you can do that disinterestedly. You can do that by separating it from what you know of the person. You can even do that with art criticism. You know, you can not really be moved or impressed or touched by something artistic, but you can look at its component pieces and its craft and go, wow, that was like that. I don't really love that song, but like the musicianship is really good. Like the guy really plays the guitar. He really knows what he's doing. But wisdom doesn't seem to follow that trend. It seems to be different to me. And it makes me think of someone like Hadot, who talks about wisdom as this kind of conduct of life, that it has to do with the transformation of the personality, that it has to do with character, and that you can't boil it down to a few arguments, or you can't boil it down to any kind of intellectual endeavor. It's like it has something to do with who the person is and what's moving them. And if we think that that's an essential part of wisdom, and I suspect it is, but to me it's an open question, then the criticism of it, I think, is a much trickier thing, because then we're talking about ad hominem, and not ad hominem necessarily in a negative sense. We're used to thinking of ad hominem as like as a refuge of scoundrels or something. But no, there seems to be something about ad hominem that's actually part of the critique of wisdom. You're critiquing where someone's coming from. It might not be the whole story, but it's part of the story. It seems to be an important part of the story. So, you know, like when we're criticizing wisdom teachers or gurus, a lot of it, you know, and not unjustly, boils down to like, do I trust that guy? Is this person legit? Is this person trustworthy? You know, sincerity. And that's a hard thing to get at, but it does seem to be part of the question and part of the way of criticizing. And maybe it should be, but if it is, then what does that mean for the person leveling the criticism? Does that mean that there has to be an aspect of self-critique in the critique of wisdom? Because how then do we account for all that other stuff, all that psychodynamic stuff, all that stuff that happens when we project onto someone and dislike them for reasons that maybe are not even obvious to us, beyond just not liking their argument? So maybe that's sort of the question that I would put out to the group just after having heard all of this is, you know, how does wisdom criticism account for self-criticism? To what degree is that actually an essential part of the process? How do we differentiate criticizing wisdom from criticizing an argument? To what degree are they the same or different? And there's another question I have too, which is sort of maybe the final one, which is that a lot of the criticism of wisdom movements or schools or whatnot are sort of distributed among the teachers of wisdom and then the followers of that teacher, the students, who sometimes take what the teacher says and refract it and take it upon themselves in different ways that maybe don't actually correspond to what the teaching was. And then how do we separate those things? Or is the teacher of wisdom ultimately responsible for the way that their teachings are taken? Maybe, I don't know. Anyway, so maybe I'll take those questions and just fan them out to you gents, and I'd just be interested to know what you think.
Thanks. Is it Christopher or Chris, by the way?
Do you want to be Chris or Christopher?
My mother is the only one that calls me Christopher. So
me too.
So we're both Chris. That's fine. Well, I'll be Chris K. I just have a couple of things that that came up when you were talking there. I don't know how well they answer some of the questions you posed, but that issue about the argument versus the person, right? And you also raised the issue of character, comes up a lot, especially in the kind of approach we do, which, you know, inevitably involves looking both at the arguments that people make, but also is reflective, you know, of their character in a respect. And there's this concept of high decouplers, right? The people who are able to take out the personal from any argument and simply look at the logic of the argument. And my contention would be that almost nobody does that ever. That people say they do it, but they're very selective, and you know, they've already decided who is worth listening to and who's not worth listening to in order to like focus on arguments. And similarly, you can't fundamentally, you know, if, in most cases, people become highly attached to their particular like argument or whatever approach that they're advocating for, such that there's a little bit of them in whatever they're presenting, and often their credentials are referenced in it. That doesn't mean that, like, say someone like Alex Jones or a terrible person cannot make a point that is correct because they are a terrible person. Terrible people make points that are correct all the time. But I think we have to be careful. And John, this relates to something you pointed out as well, that I don't doubt the sincerity in most cases of the people that, you know, might be identified by some as like manipulative guru types. I think in a lot of cases, the people are very sincere in their own belief in their argument and the advice that they're giving. Now, of course, there are people that are, you know, intentionally lying and that kind of thing. But I think in most cases, people are the heroes of their own story. And so I guess I want to argue that there's a little bit of a potential false dichotomy that's separating the two, because people's arguments will often tie back into their larger system of thoughts. You can take individual points that Jordan Peterson might make, but as fans often say, you know, when you look at the whole, it connects into all these different avenues that he wants to argue for. So I guess I'm pushing back on the notion that we can fully distinguish arguments and individuals, and in the same way that, you know, there are people like the Chogyam Trungpa who might have insights on spiritual materialism or that kind of thing, but be terrible people who are sexually abusing their followers, and that does give you some information. It doesn't mean you can't extract anything useful from what they say. The fact that Jordan Peterson promotes climate change contrarianism doesn't mean there's no advice in 12 Rules for Life that is useful. But what it does signal to me is that you have to be a little bit wary when you see somebody making these leaps in logic in one domain, that they aren't doing the same thing in other domains. And that's the last thing I'll say, is that's something that we see a lot in the people that we cover, that you see what people are arguing for in one area bleeding into other areas. So when you see somebody making arguments that give you pause, it's usually worth like considering how that impacts their, you know, their broader arguments. And I'll shut up now.
I think if we're going to adopt the Chris and Christopher convention, I think Chris, I think you've highlighted something that, well, you've highlighted many things, but I'll start on this point. Yeah, I think many of the people you're talking about are sincere, and therefore, again, I think the phenomena of self-deception, which is something that is studied very well, and it's one of the areas of psychology, for example, that is not falling prey to the replication crisis, is a central thing here. Whether or not we want to consider wisdom a construct, I think the ability to ameliorate self-deception, and then the second point you made, Chris, not just in one domain, but in an integrated manner across multiple domains, that's what I am primarily trying to put my finger on. I want to find, is it possible, and it doesn't seem, there's no logical impossibility, that individuals could have very reliable practices, virtues, skills, whatever we want to say, for overcoming self-deception, and that they do so in a way that is not just in one domain, but across multiple domains in an integrated manner. That's what I meant by a broadened notion of rationality. And so I think I'm trying to make the argument, and maybe you'll push back on it, but I think the notion of critique you keep invoking is actually overlapping or presupposing the very kind of thing I'm trying to put my finger on. I mean, I get it that that's not what everybody means by wisdom, but I have made this argument for this notion of wisdom public repeatedly. And so I think that it is, and therefore, I guess I'm pushing back on Matthew. I don't think we're guilty of reification. I think it's something that is being presupposed by the very kinds of critiques you're bringing against people. I agree, we should look at people. How much, and self-deception is different from ignorance, right? And so how much are these people falling prey to all of the ways in which we know people can fall prey to self-deception, right? Are they falling prey to the confirmation bias? Are they falling prey to my side bias? Are they incapable of taking other people's perspectives because of a kind of endemic egocentrism? Like, all of this can be studied. It can be studied experimentally. It can be studied by multiple places. And then we can also ask the question, to what degree are they doing this in a domain general versus a domain specific fashion? And that is where the question, I think, starts to get very powerful, because I take it that your critique is that these people are largely not liars and bad faith actors. I agree with you, though there are. But although they can cause harm, they're relatively sort of easy to deal with epistemically. They're just, they're liars and they're bullshit artists, etc. The interesting and therefore difficult cases, which you're putting your finger on, are the people who are self-deceived. And then the fact that they often don't show that comprehensively. They'll be very self-deceived in this area and very competent, and then they elide and slide between them in a way that misleads people. But that means that there's an implicit normative thing of individuals that aren't self-deceived and that do that in a domain general and integrated manner should be given a kind of praise in comparison to the individuals that we criticize for failing at that. That's just the argument I'm making.
Yeah, I think, look, I might start by saying a couple of things that sound a bit mean, but then I'm going to make a surprising and huge concession. So on one hand, like I'm going to stick to my guns regarding the danger of reification. Sometimes something seems to, like a concept that we have in our heads, it seems to hang together a bunch of qualities in this folk concept, doesn't necessarily warrant that once you start digging into the process of actually how the mind works, how judgment, decision making, etc. works. I mean, I could refer back to the and this sounds mean, but the old phrenology diagrams back in the day, and they had all the little sections drawn out on the skull. There were some of those that have stuck around, like conscientiousness, but other ones like valor or sublimity haven't, right? But those made sense at the time in that particular culture and that particular zeitgeist. I mean, in the kind of zeitgeist that we've got happening today, when we have the mention of wisdom happening in public, I actually just stopped and thought, well, where do I see it? Well, I see it in the self-help section of the bookstore, and I see it in inspirational memes. And this isn't a cheap shot, because I'm going to make the concession in a second. But I just want to make the point out that, in the folk imagination, it has a sort of emotional and cultural resonance that we shouldn't necessarily take super seriously in an analytical scientific framework. But I want to concede that actually I do think like wisdom is a real thing, right? I don't know if it's something that it sort of can be studied at this point in time very carefully, but if you just look at your everyday life, it's absolutely real. Like I think I'm a bit older and wiser than I used to be. I think I'm a bit stupider than I was when I was 25. I don't have quite, I'm not quite as sharp as I used to be, but you know, you learn a few tricks along the way. I learn to sometimes it's best not to say anything when my wife or someone that I know is in a bad mood. It's just shut up, right? That's wisdom, right? You know, recognizing that I'm sort of my instinctive response to something is like, what new fresh hell is this? Maybe that's just a reflection of the kind of age that I am and the position in life, and just having that reflexivity. So I think on a sort of on an everyday interpersonal level, I believe it's real, and it's something, and you know, it's a virtue. It's something worth having. I think once we shift into the public sphere, right, where people are sitting in front of a camera, or they're writing an article, or they're engaging in some kind of public presentation, then they are playing a role, right, to one degree or another. And I think it's in all of their interests to appear wise. And certainly people are looking to hear from wise people, but there's almost, it's very difficult to even, I mean, I think we can sort of show the negative. We can often tell when someone like Alex Jones is maybe lacking self-reflexivity or wisdom. But you know, it's very hard to tell much about the true character of a person through their public appearances. And you know, I think perhaps we're on different wavelengths, is that Chris and I are kind of doing a study of the media landscape, if you like, and how that works out. John and Chris, you've both got an academic and philosophical and scientific interest in wisdom as a topic of academic interest. So I think that's where we're coming from, different places.
Matthew, I really like I like this idea that when we all step into the recorded spotlight, we're all taking a role. And I think that there's something about that strikes me as very true, and almost unavoidably true. Even right now, there's a tension of us all having stepped into a role and trying to do it sincerely and authentically. But there's immediately a tension when you're called to speak publicly, and if you have any idea of the limits of your own limits, if you have any idea of the enormity of your ignorance, there's something enormously crushing about that, and yet we do it anyway. And I'm wondering about that. Like, that's interesting to me, and it's interesting to me not as an abstract idea, but as something we're actually doing right now. And it's something obviously I do with John, but it's something I think that you two fellas do as well on your podcast, which is that you extemporize, right? You're coming in with a certain amount of knowledge and a certain, you know, you're coming in with a lot. We're all lacking a lot at the same time, and we're using what it is that we have, and we're trading it, and we're pulling it apart, and we're doing something with it. And we've made this implicit decision that whatever we're doing with it is worth the time to do, and that there's some value in it. Or if we haven't made that decision consciously, then we've made it somehow, because here we are, we're doing it. But then that takes different forms, right? Because you have the sort of the polished presentation of a paper where you've had the time to curate an argument, and hopefully you've put some time into making sure that there's actually an argument, and that if you're bringing knowledge to bear, that you can source it properly, and that you're not just being spurious. And then there's something else that happens, and that something else is the kind of thing that John and I are doing a lot, which is that you sit down and you use what you know or what you don't know, and you just basically try and sort of use it in such a way that it doesn't become the object of what you're doing, but that it becomes a different kind of game, like an exercise. And that exercise is playing with the extent of your own ignorance and trying to do something playful with ideas, not to actually get them right or get them accurate or get them precise, but to do something a little bit more artistic, a little bit more creative. And that whatever comes out of that creative exercise isn't that you've acquired new knowledge exactly, but that your relationship to it is different, right? Or the relationship you have with one another and the relationship you have with the whole exercise is different, right? And so there's this knowledge wisdom tension in that, I think, right? Because it's like I'm presenting a paper, I'm trying to disseminate something and make a very clear argument. That strikes me as something very different from sitting down with somebody and trading ideas in such a way that we're actually trying to build something with them. And we're not exactly concerned with being right and wrong, because that's not really the point. We're trying to do something else. We're trying to get into a certain kind of state where learning can happen. And it's the learning that comes from the dialogue. It's the learning through the ideas that is actually the practice. That's a very hard thing, though, to explain, because if someone tunes in and sees two people just trading a bunch of ideas in a very kind of slap and dash fashion, it's really easy to look at that and say, like, oh my God, these guys are just full of shit. Like, what are they doing? And I'm really sensitive to that impression. And I think somehow there's the difference between the bullshit and actually doing something valuable has to do with why we're playing the game, what exactly the game is and exactly what it's for, and how it's framed by that ignorance, and how self-conscious we are about that ignorance, how much humility there is in the margins. That's a real tension. Like, I think it's really tricky, and I'm hearing that a little bit in what all of you are saying. So I mean, Chris and Matthew, like specifically you guys, I'm curious to know what you make of that difference in those forms of speech and how that interacts with this question of wisdom.
Oh, Matt, maybe I'll respond, and then you can if you want to correct me. So yeah, like we've covered content which has the takes the form of the kind of conversations you're discussing, Chris. That people are bouncing ideas off each other and somewhat speculatively, and of course in conversation people are going to misspeak or go off in tangents, and I'm a prime example of this to anybody that's listened to the podcast. But so I think that you have to allow for that, and you also have to allow that academics just as guilty as everyone else of enjoying having conversations with people that share interests and bouncing ideas around, right? People in business like this, people who like Breaking Bad, they all enjoy discussing their topic of interest together. And I don't want to in any way disparage that kind of thing. Just people, getting together and enjoying discussing a shared topic of interest. What I would criticize, however, is so in some of the content we looked at, there was this discussion of a thing called the Omega rule or the Omega principle. Can't remember which one, but doesn't matter that much. Basic idea was try to look for the kernels of truth in the argument that the person's presenting. Even if it's 90% bullshit, take the 10% which is good and focus on that. And the problem for me there is, first of all, that if an argument is 90% bullshit and 10% good, it's misleading to focus on the 10% that is valid, because there's a huge amount of a nonsense cloud floating around beside that. And second is that, and this could be a reductionist, kind of sciencey mindset, but that the way that we make progress, I think, in a lot of steps is not from being indulgent of other people, but saying, hold on, how does that idea hang together with the other things that you've said there, right? Or pushing back, and not pushing back in the way of just saying, I have a minor disagreement that, might change a little bit of the point you made there, but actually forcefully disagreeing with people. And in a number of the conversations we've covered, that's seen as disqualifying, not playing the game appropriately. Kind of interrupting the jazz, the sense-making jazz that is going on. And so I guess I would throw a question back to you two in a way that I'll give you an example, and I'm not doing this to put you either of you on the spot. I just want to make it concrete. So when I was looking at some content from Jonathan Pajot, he did a video about Alex Jones. And he mentioned to his audience that Alex Jones is you know, he's wrong, he's kind of crazy and all this kind of things, but he's fundamentally got good insight, and he just lacks the right vocabulary. Now, to me, that's not just a throwaway thing. That's an indication that there's a problem with the way that he's approaching people like Alex Jones, because either the best option is he hasn't done the research and he doesn't know what Alex Jones says, because Alex Jones is a racist, bigoted, far-right conspiracy theorist who just also happens to be a Christian extremist that you know, likes religious symbolism. Now, if your only point is he waffles about religious symbolism, that's okay. But for me, telling your audience that he has fundamentally good insight and just lacks the right vocabulary is a big problem. And it makes me then more skeptical about your ability to discern like good arguments or insightful points, right? And in, as I say, in the best case, it's a lack of research, but not enough, a lack that would stop you from putting out a video on the topic of Alex Jones. And my kind of point would be, I would find it very unusual for that to come up in any conversation that I would see, like, you know, between John and Jonathan, or Jordan and Jonathan, or David Fuller and Jonathan. But to me, that is something that somebody should raise and say, you know, isn't that an issue? Or the same with Jordan Peterson reeling about anti-vaccine things, that kind of thing. So that to me is something I'm curious about how you guys grapple with, or whether you think, you know, no, you know, people are a constellation of ideas and you shouldn't fixate on just, you know, whatever their politics or whatever the individual things they promote. You're not responsible for it. So I'm just curious, you know, how you guys react to that point.
What would be appropriate here? A response, or Matt, you completing the response to Chris? You're fine with me responding?
Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
That's very important. So there's a couple issues. One is we're trying to get people to return to a notion of opponent processing rather than adversarial processing, right? Opponent processing, which I think is at the heart of democratic endeavor, is I'm your best chance at self-correction and you are my best chance at self-correction. And we have to therefore have a certain kind of commitment to that. Adversarial is the idea that it's a zero-sum game, and the point of the conversation is to destroy the opposition. And the second type is too prevalent right now, and it of course exacerbates polarization in a kind of rapidly spiraling way. Nevertheless, like, for example, I wouldn't do that about Alex Jones. I do think that I think Stanovich is right. The hallmark of rationality is the ability to value the process, not just the product of your cognition. And so if somebody is engaging in processes that result in even conclusions I like, I hope, now of course I'm going to suffer from my side bias like everybody else, but I hope I've trained myself enough at times that I will call that out and try and push back on it. But I usually push back on it by trying to be a little bit more Socratic. I try to ask questions and get people to unpack where they're coming from, and very often that will have a very powerful way of influencing people, in which, in contrast to the direct adversarial approach, hence the Socratic process. Now, it has, of course, there's no panacea practice. It has its dangers too. You can be seen to be endorsing things that you don't endorse. I have this problem in my conversations, especially with Jordan. I try to make it clear that there are entire aspects of his thinking that I don't endorse, I try to criticize him on some of his sort of fundamental philosophical presuppositions. I've done this to his face. I think he misinterprets postmodernism and doesn't see the value in it, and I've challenged him on that. But I think getting the balance between these two is tricky. And for me, and I try to make it clear, and I hope it's not. And Chris, I think you have a potentially good rejoinder here, but I hope it's not just a cop-out. But I'm very much trying to learn that virtue and virtuosity of getting that balance, so that there's enough commitment that we stay in opponent processing and don't drift into adversarial. But I balance that off against an appropriate kind of challenge and pushback, and try to make it clear when it's important what I'm not endorsing. But I'm very much trying to learn this, and again, I'm not trying to step out of responsibility. In fact, I'm trying to state the opposite. I take this very seriously, and I take it that this is a virtue that I'm responsible for cultivating. I'm hoping to do it by doing it with the way we cultivate all virtues, by doing it in interactions with other people and reflection and discussion and looking at exemplary cases, etc. But my response to you, Chris, is I take very seriously what you're saying, and I don't mean just in words. I try to exemplify how I take it seriously and how I try to respond to it. Jonathan and I, we do disagree, and we disagree precisely at some of those points that you're putting your finger on. But right now, I'm laying my epistemic and perhaps even moral bets that there's more in common that we are talking about that can serve as bridges between secular and non-secular people that could be of value right now than that we're at odds about. We do come up against each other, but I think there's also enough that we can bridge, and I think if we don't build good bridges between the secular and the scientific, between the secular and the spirit and the scientific and the spiritual and the non-spiritual, I think we're in a lot of trouble. It's a judgment call on my part, and you have every right to criticize me around that. But I don't think anybody else has anything other than a judgment call on their part to offer. I don't think there's any algorithm or rule for deciding this. If you make a good criticism, I hope I will respond to it. I've tried to actually respond to criticisms, go on the channel of people who criticize me. And so I'm trying to say, I admit it's a judgment call. I've given you my reasons for it. And I would argue that I don't think anybody else has anything but a judgment call around trying to get that balance. That would be my response.
Yeah, I appreciate that, John. I think we both do. I mean, a judgment call is all you can do, and all I think we are doing here is just giving our opinion. But I think you guys would identify with where we're coming from, because you guys are academics like us, and one of the things I've always loved about academia is the culture of critique. My colleague used to say academia is all about getting kicked in the nuts and saying, thank you very much, please do that again. Because all the time, it's all about criticism. You're a PhD student, you hand your thing, it's red pen all over it. You try to submit papers to get published, and it comes back saying, this is rubbish, send it somewhere else, we don't want to see it. I could go on, right? I've gone to conferences and had other professors stand up there and just lay into me everything. I'm wrong about everything. Then afterwards we go have a drink, right? It was good. It is good. And academia's got a lot of problems with it. I think it's not guilty of a lot of the stuff that it's accused of, like a crushing culture of orthodoxy and conformity and political correctness, at least not in the little part of it that I'm in. And I think it's got some real virtues there around robust intellectual culture, which in the public sphere would do well to emulate, and people who are emissaries from that culture, like including some of the people we've talked about, like Jordan Peterson, these people who are public figures, we really should be trying to bring that kind of culture into this discourse land that we kind of inhabit, whether it's YouTube videos or podcasts or whatever. And just honestly, this is just an honest personal reflection. When Chris and I started doing the podcast, then we just naturally started sort of interacting with people, you know, people that we were interviewing, people that had other podcasts, people that wanted to do cross promotions, come on our podcast, we'll go on your podcast. We saw how people reacted when you criticized them publicly and said, no, you can't do it. They were shocked. They're really shocked and appalled, because that doesn't happen. That doesn't happen. You're not allowed to do that. If you've got a problem with someone, you have a quiet chat, you know, privately, and you sort it out. And if there is any kind of public sort of debate, it's, as Chris said before, it's done extremely delicately. Like you're a flaming genius, but, you know, I just had this one little, you know, wrinkle with what you've said. Maybe I can build on it, right? So it's like an old boys club, right, of cross promotional backslapping. We're all fantastic, you know. And I say, that's not like academia. It's not, at least not at its best. So I say, for all of us who come from an academic background and are sort of venturing out and dipping our toe in the public discourse, let's show people how it's done. And if there's a lot of people out there, people who listen to our show, and maybe people who are watching this, who are intellectually curious, are very clever on their own bat, but for one reason or another haven't gone into academia, they would like to, you know, after work, you know, tune in and participate in some way, shape or form in good intellectual, academic, cultural discussions and so on. And so I say, let's bring some of that out in the public sphere.
I don't know if we're disagreeing, but I remember up until I wrote my thesis, I was just critiquing other theories, and then I started to realize that critique has to be balanced with construction and cooperation. Science is very much a communitarian thing. You have to cooperate with people. We need to not just critique. We also have to properly integrate in response to the critique. We have to construct new ideas. Even Popper said, you know, you should try and falsify bold hypotheses, right? And so I think there's a proper balance again in academia, and I've seen that it can. You're right, Matthew. It can become. And I've seen academia become around certain ideas, you know, an old boys club. I'm in third generation cog-sci, and it took a lot of work to get people out of first gen. Computers are the accurate and precise model of cognition. It took a lot of work to get people out of that. And there was a lot of critique, but what I can say is the critique didn't really hold until an alternative became available, right? There was all these critiques, even some of the greatest computationalists, Jerry Fodor, would critique that view. But it was only when neural networks and dynamical systems became available as constructed of alternatives that the critique really started to take hold and people started to shift how they did the science. And I was actually finishing my thesis at around that time. So I was on that cusp, and I was seeing about trying to get the balance. And this is what I guess I'm talking about again, between, I think academia is actually this optimal grip, this constantly shifting balance between critique and construction. I'm hoping that we can represent both sides of those and their proper relationship when we go out into the public sphere. But I think it's very, very tricky. I think it's very, very tricky because when there is, and I think this is your point, if I'm misrepresenting you, please correct me, but we have sort of these established scripts. And one of them is, you know, the script of everybody just agrees because we're polite, and Canadians are particularly vulnerable to that script. But then there's also the other script which is, you know, what we're going to do is we're just going to tear each other apart. And that also, I don't think is conducive. You need to get this balance between people being willing to listen to both critique and to listen to, you know, good insight, good proposal, and to me that. But now I think we're actually moving back into the notion we were originally talking about, which is I think about, you know, trying to get the balance between these different kinds of demands, such that we optimize how people are interacting with each other in the social sphere. So again, I don't know if we disagreed or if
I have a point, John, that I think at least might tangentially relate to that. So and I also I completely sign off on Matt's point about the importance, of which you've emphasized as well about everybody recognizing they're coming with their own biases, and this isn't an intervention. It's purely us like stating our position on things, and people are free to draw their boundaries or their assessments completely differently. And you made the point about, in essence, right, trying to build bridges between secular and religious people, or you could say religious people with a range of different approaches: Muslims, Christians, Buddhists coming together into faith dialogue. And I'm very much in favor of that as well, right? I'm an atheist, but a fairly liberal, pluralistic type. So the more that people come together and recognize their similarities, the better from my point of view. But I'm also, my research specialty is in religion and religious psychology and the psychology of ritual. One thing which has been like potentially distorting in the study of religion, academic study of religion, is an over focus on the kind of positive aspects or community building or these kind of things. And in some ways you can present that as a reaction against new atheism or whatever way, but there genuinely are things like a lot of the world is religious. A lot of religious countries have restrictive laws targeting even things like leaving a particular religion, right? And punishments for various infractions of religious codes. So I think it's still important to recognize that, like, while there are these kind of liberal and metaphorical more interpretations of religion, there also is the fundamentalist and strong version of religion. And it isn't just like a minor offshoot. It is in many countries like a highly influential dominant thing. And similarly, I think theologians in every tradition often have very complex and philosophically dense views about the nature of God and so on. And I'm not saying that all religious believers lack that, but I will say that the actual traditions, that the way that they're typically practiced, there's a hell of a split between theologians and lay practitioners, and ignoring what the lay practitioners are doing in favor of the kind of dense theological construct, I think is sometimes potentially misleading. So to try and take it to an example where maybe we would slightly disagree, like I heard one of your talks, and you were talking about religion, the gym as a god, or the internet as a god, right? And that you can, and when I heard that, I can see definitely the ways that you can draw parallels, right? People are going, devoting themselves, they're kind of worshiping their screens, all these kind of metaphorical parallels. But there's also these like important distinctions as well, and that's why I think Matt and I are a little wary, especially after listening to the content that we do, that metaphors let you draw parallels between a whole host of things, and they let you paper over actually like important concrete differences. So maybe in some case in a conversation, people discussing egregores are suggesting in a way that it's a metaphysical being which has the ability to inhabit minds, whereas on your side you're more talking about the dynamics of social groups and emergent behavior from that. But I worry that as well as the potential to like build bridges, that you can also end up like distorting in a cloud what the actual arguments being made are which is real, do demons, and that's sometimes presented as like that's a reductive question, but in the real world people are accused of being witches in African countries. You know, throughout history, people were burnt for being like sinners and believing the wrong thing. So yeah, I take the point about we should be extending across and not focusing on our differences and slamming each other. But sometimes reality like slams the differences in, and yeah, I think it's important to like stay cognizant of that.
That's great, and I think that's important. Um, I think the body of my work points to the fact that I have a sort of a profound ambivalence towards religion. I even talk about the religion that's not a religion because of that. And I also repeatedly say neither utopia nor fundamental nor nostalgia. And you get fundamentalisms in both of those directions, deep nostalgia, deep utopia. And so I repeatedly, I even say, put it on my tombstone, neither utopia nor nostalgia. And so I'm my I mean, I don't want, I don't have the right or the authority to speak to individual cases. If people take my work and it enables them to go back into their religion and find more meaning and cultivate more virtue and their relationships get better, etc. I don't think I have any place from which I could judge that. I do reject many of the metaphors and the myths that are central to a lot of religious frameworks. The West has, for example, I think, been beset by a mythology around the two worlds mythology. That there's the everyday world and there's some better upper world. It's either Greek above us or Hebrew in front of us in time, and we get these kinds of myths. And they served a function. They allowed people to talk about experiences of self-transcendence. Even the word transcendence carries the myth within it, right? And these experiences are real. They can be transformative, but of course, there's a sense in which that kind of ontology is collapsing in a very profound way. And so, and I'm just giving this as an instance, Chris. I think that it's important to criticize the metaphors and the myths. The thing with I mean, I do believe there's good argument and there's good evidence. There's even, Hole has a mathematical proof of the existence of sort of collective causal powers above and beyond just an aggregation of the individual components. My friend Jan Chiappe and I, we published articles on how the NASA scientists interacting with the rovers on Mars formed this distributed cognitive system. Ed Hutchins did the ethnography on that with no one person navigates a ship, it's a system of people and equipment. So I think the idea of collective intelligence and distributed cognition is powerful. I think it's plausible. And are there practices that people can engage in where that the sense of that can become more phenomenologically present to them? Of course. I don't think this is that. That's where Jonathan and I agree. Is it possible that people then talk about that invoking gods and angels? Well, that's kind of a Durkheimian thesis, right? That's kind of what they're doing. And so again, yeah, that seems plausible. Then do I think they have consciousness? No, I explicitly say no, they don't. And there's where most of the cognitive scientists would agree with me. And then Jonathan actually said that I might be right about that, to give him credit. Do they pre-exist human beings? My answer is definitively and repeatedly no. Jonathan says yes. We disagree about that, right? But at that point, right, it's like, once that's clear, it's like, can we still get people, because what typically happens is people are more interested in the shared stuff. They're like, oh, I hadn't thought about the possibility of that. In general, we solve problems better in groups than we do as individuals. And this goes down to reasoning tasks, like all the evidence that's emerging. You take a standard reasoning task that individuals reliably did very poorly on, like the Wason selection task. Even our best, most intelligent people only get it right 10% of the time. You replace it with 4 people that are allowed to talk to each other, and the success rate goes from 10% to 80%. Now that's not one, that's not just one, there's many findings like that. And people find that very, very powerful and interesting because we have this sort of monological model of what it is to be rational. And I think for me, emphasizing that where we bridge, well, doing what you said, Chris, saying where I do disagree, and I just gave you the two places. I don't believe that. I don't believe with good reason they've had consciousness. I've said that. I don't believe they pre-exist human beings, and I've said that, right? But nevertheless, the idea that rationality might be more dialogical than monological in nature, and that we might participate in this in ways that make it more present to us as an experience, I think that's powerful and important.
Yeah.
So I'm trying to, I'm sorry, I'm not trying to merely defend myself. I'm trying to show you that I'm taking your point seriously, that I'm endeavoring to get that balance that I keep speaking about.
Yeah, I mean, I think I speak for Chris as well when I said, like, we really would endorse like an awful lot of what you said, because The Extended Phenotype is one of my favorite books. Was very interested in sociobiology. We both like social ed sex, definitely, and definitely very interesting and intelligent things can happen in a distributed context. I think what all Chris was saying, and I'm not going to say much, maybe just draw a line under it, is that there are, we just need to acknowledge that, like, anytime you talk about something subtle and counterintuitive, like quantum mechanics, yeah, there will be people that want to smuggle in the magic, because people like magic. So just maybe our humble suggestion is to keep an eye out for it.
Matthew, in reply to that, I regularly and reliably, I did it even today, criticize quantum woo. The idea that, quantum is weird, consciousness is weird, therefore that's ridiculous and it's a stupid argument. And I disparage it pretty reliably. Sometimes people are saying something real. There's good evidence that the sense of smell actually makes use of quantum differences, that you can actually detect things at the quantum level. But there's no evidence that that's the case in sight or hearing or touch, right? And so sometimes people are saying something, I think, that should be taken seriously. Most of the time it's garbage. But again, yes, of course, right? But when people want to say to me, well, there's a problem, we can't seem to reconcile quantum mechanics and relativity, and we keep failing, and so maybe there's a fundamental presupposition we should challenge, I take that as a serious philosophical argument. There's a reliable history of inductive and theoretical failure that points to the possibility that there might be some fundamental presupposition at work that needs to be challenged. I think that's a reasonable response. I think that's a very reasonable, but I think that is very different from quantum woo.
All right, I'm gonna jump in here. Thank you, gentlemen. That was a very engaging discussion. I'm going to just put people off spotlight. And a quick question. We're scheduled for 90 minutes originally. Is everyone okay to go like 15 minutes after the bottom of the hour, just to field a few questions or any hard stops?
That's fine for me.
Cool. So I'll warm up the STOA with a question or two, and let there be light in the STOA. Everyone feel free to turn on their camera now. If you have any questions, pop them in the chat. So I'm hoping to ask a question each for each team, team criticism, team wisdom. And so the first question I have is for team criticism. And as Christopher knows, I used to be a part of this private debate experiment that was pretty intense. And there were two roles. One was a questioner role and one was like an answerer. And the answerer had only two rules: had to speak what they believed to be true and could not interrupt. And the questioner could do anything really. They can engage in propositional criticism, can go personal, could they yell, interrupt, lie, do anything. And it was quite intense. And what we found, it turned into like philosophical rap battles eventually, where like people drop bars, and it's like if you insulted the person in such a way where it's like it pointed out the egoic elephant in the room, everyone was like, oh, and it had like such a good impact. And the whole experience like really humbled me. And the guys were super smart, but it wasn't the propositional critique that did it. It was the insults, especially the really, really good ones. So, and when I see what you guys are doing with the coding of the gurus, it's like two things. It's robust criticism, and it's like roasting in a way, like making fun, teasing, getting snarky. And that makes a lot of sense to me, because if you want to reach out to someone who is presumably hard to reach out to because of their ego, then you have to engage in something that's more effective, like a roast. So I'm curious if you had any thoughts about what I said, and what do you think the wisdom of the roast is?
Yeah, I have some thoughts about that. And I'm curious, Peter, about how far people could go. Like, you know, you said anything goes. So is that taking
No
the top
physical
off
violence, no
everything?
physical violence.
Yeah.
That close sometimes.
But in any case, it sounds like an interesting experiment. But part of the thing, like you correctly point out with our podcast, is that, you know, in the high-minded sense that we're looking critically at content and stuff, but we are 100% not above like having fun and taking the piss out of things. Now, I think part of that is that there isn't a huge amount of strategy to it, rather than it's Matt and I's personality, and you know, it would be hard for me not to respond in that way. I'd actually have to, like, you know, keep myself under control not to respond like that. But that includes the things that I like. You know, we've covered content where we're in broad agreement with the people, and yes, in those cases, you know, maybe I'm more exercised whenever I'm talking about somebody promoting anti-vaccine rhetoric or that kind of thing than I am somebody just like Anthony de Mello, the Jesuit, talking about, you know, the nature of truth. But in both cases, I think that, like, it doesn't hurt, and indeed it helps to, in those kind of conversations and the kind of content we're looking at, to puncture to a certain extent the self-importance inherent in it. And again, you know, I'm not saying that any of us here are immune from having that done to us as well. But I think it is good to have a kind of lighthearted approach to these things, and not always take everything as if it's life and death. So, you know, like Matt has pointed out, when I get critical feedback from articles that I've submitted or that kind of thing, you're often, your reaction to receiving harsh criticism can be emotional and, like, kind of you know, angry, right? But often, given the benefit of a bit of time and perspective, you say, well, actually, you know, maybe they were right, that I should have included more of those points and that kind of thing. So I think that, yeah, that it is useful to have a sense of humor about things. And I don't know that it's an intentional strategy of ours, but it yeah, hopefully Matt, you have anything to add there? I'm wandered into the weeds.
No, we'll get on to more questions. I'll just say, yeah, it's not an intentional strategy. It's partly our cultural backgrounds, I think, mostly our personalities. To the extent that it makes any kind of sense, I think it is, helpful to puncture self-importance. And the last thing we would like to do is for people to take us overly seriously in the way that we recommend that people don't do with gurus.
All right, so I have a question for John and Chris, but any quick response to the previous question? Ooh, can people hear Chris, or?
Sorry, can you hear me now? Yeah, I would underline everything they just. I know it's boring to agree, but I have to. It's the role of humor, I think, in all of this is sort of under celebrated. There needs to be more of it. It's a thought. It's actually something I've been thinking about a lot recently too. Is that there's so much potential. There's so much danger for self-importance in all of this, and there's something about the humiliation that comes with being poked fun at that can disarm a lot of that. and then you can learn to appreciate it. And there's so much good that it can do, and there's so much wisdom even just in that it almost deserves its own conversation.
So this question is for John and Christopher. So Hans-Georg Muller is a philosopher in the University of Macau. He came to the Stoa recently and criticized authenticity, and talks about a move towards what he calls genuine pretending. In essence, what you were like gesturing towards earlier, Christopher, about there's always a performative quality in one's public performance. And it strikes me as foolish to perform as wise, even if you are. And one challenge I see is that if you're not performing as wise, but talking about wisdom publicly, something that's very hard to define and criticize, as talked about today, I see the potential risk of certain unhealthy parasocial dynamics emerging, that the speaker of wisdom will be pattern matched as someone as wise of those who are following them. And how I'm wondering how that could lead in subtle ways and bend towards a self-deception. And so I know you thought a lot about this, John, and I'm curious what your concerns about unhealthy parasocial projections and dynamics are, and how to wisely respond to them.
Yeah, I mean, that critique, I mean, there's been others. Adorno, of course, famously has his critique against authenticity. And of course, many of the critiques are also, well, at least some of them, the ones I've read, emphasize that the term has almost come to mean the exact opposite of what it meant when it was originally proposed by Heidegger. So it's a tricky thing to respond to, because I think there was value in what Heidegger was talking about authenticity, which is about, genuinely putting yourself into relationship with things like your mortality and your finitude. And that's what authenticity was primarily what was going on, at least as I read Heidegger. And I think that's something that human beings should do. I think it's important I think it's one of the ways we distinguish mature people from immature people. So if that's what you mean by authenticity, if you mean this sense of I'm true to my true self and I have a true self from birth, or some, well, I'll say it, bullshit like that, because I think that is bullshit, I think we should put aside that notion of authenticity. And so for me, the issue then is, how can I show up virtuously in this? Which is, what can I put in place that will tend to counteract the possibility of gurification, the possibility of self-importance. I do a lot of things. I try to be very, very careful about sharing credit and saying where I get my ideas from, and not making it seem like the ideas are spouting from my face hole as if they were spouting, the way Athena sprung from Zeus's head. I try to demonstrate the cooperative community production of ideas. I do this in many of my shows, where I try to, I have me and a bunch of other people talking together and working out together what the nature of the self might be, etc. And with people who have already independently established theoretical position, so it's not just everybody clapping for each other. I try to I've set up an organization, Vervaeke Foundation, that I have an arm's length relationship with. Most of the money goes there. Most of the decisions about sort of recognition go there. I find that, in fact, the most recent board meeting, I find this tremendously liberating. I have no doubt that if I was closer to the money and closer to the spotlight, that it would be deeply corrupting. I've tried to learn from the mistakes that I've seen others make, Jordan Peterson, Ken Wilber, others. Not that and that's not me saying that I think everything they've said is garbage or anything like that. I'm not saying that, but I've tried to pay attention. I try to engage in self-correction. I try to, like, for example, I had more than one episode, but one episode in particular, because it's germane to our topic, where I critiqued my own 2012 paper on the nature of wisdom. And I tried to say what was lacking in it, what was importantly missing. And so I'm trying to figure out, because there's no good source to go to on this. I'm trying to figure out, with the cooperation and help of a lot of people, things to put in place that will try and help me show up as virtuously as possible in this space. I'm open to hearing more suggestions from people. Of course, I get lots that are crazy and ridiculous, but I'm also open to getting good ones. So, Peter, I don't think there's like maybe there is, but I don't have like a sort of a tight theoretical proposal. I'm trying a bunch of things, and I've named them to you in order to try and show up as virtuously as possible in the space. And I don't know if there's anything else that I could do right now. I'm not saying, I'm clearly, in fact, I'm trying to emphasize, I'm not claiming to do this perfectly. I've already made some serious mistakes. I've apologized to people when I've made mistakes, when I got them wrong. I've done that publicly online. When people in the comments catch me out for a factual matter, I'll immediately apologize and correct it. I don't know what else we could sorry, and I mean this as a question. I don't mean this as like I don't know. I'm ignorant of what else could or should be done, but I'm willing to learn.
Christopher, any follow-up there?
I don't know. I kind of want to keep it moving, because I know there are other questions. Maybe I'll just say I think that this idea of genuine pretend, just on a completely different tack, this idea of genuine pretending is really interesting, because I think that it speaks to this idea that because we're all multivocal, because we all have different aspects to ourselves, there's sort of when the lights go on and we step onto a camera and we step into a public place, something different happens. We're augmented by that. And I don't think there's any use pretending that we're not. And I don't think there's any use pretending that, who I am in the pub exactly matches the persona or demeanor that the recorded, the recorded dialogue or the public forum pronounces. Obviously, you hope there's some consistency, and you hope that there's a mutual awareness between those parts. But I don't think I think I used to think that this idea of showing up with absolute consistency in every single forum was sort of possible or desirable. And I think something about this process has shown me that I'm not sure that it is, or I don't know, maybe it's just not for me. Like there's an inherent theater to this kind of process, and it might be very, very subtle, but it's there. And I think one of the most interesting things, and I think this sort of returns back to the question of how to comport wisely, or to try in this kind of exercise, is to develop a bit of an axis between, the part of you that's sort of off stage and the quiet and in privacy, and the part of you that sort of comes online when you come online, and to figure out how to relate those two together so that they can actually learn from one another, so that there's a continuity, but there's enough of a tension there that you can understand what kind of dynamic is at play between them. Because it's not always obvious, right? Like when people are in the spotlight, things come out of you that you don't expect. And it's like, whoa, what was that? Well, maybe I should pay attention to what's going on so I can learn from it. And so I can bring that back with me and to quiet contemplation, which is where a lot of the real work happens. So I think this idea, when I hear that, I don't know what the argument is properly, Peter, that you're referencing, but when I hear that term, it sort of makes me think of that. It makes me think of the fact that we different aspects of us get pulled out, and when they're unaware of one another, and when we mistake one part for the rest, I think that's when some serious inflation starts to happen, and I think that we get into trouble. So I think it has something to do with just maintaining a thoughtful tension between those things. Anyway, that's maybe just a thought on that.
All right, thank you, John and Christopher. So I'm going to be mindful of the time, and we'll do a closeout now, and I'll weave in some of the questions that I've been seeing. So perhaps we can go around the panel one last time, start with Chris K, then John, then Matt. Just any closing shares that you would like to provide, and perhaps like anything from that you're taking away from this exchange that happened today, maybe something that's at as you're thinking that you'll be considering post session. So I'll take in Chris.
What a joy to go first when asked to reflect on things. But yeah, so like I think that there's a lot of agreement about criticism being valuable, and that wisdom as a virtue is something that I think everybody signs off on. So the devil, I think, is in the details, and that there's a need for charity and for like a generosity to people, including people that hold different philosophical or religious positions than you. The world's a big place, but so I'm on board with all of that, and I guess the thing that I would just emphasize as like the kind of the core point that I always return to is that I think somebody asked in the chat about what Matt and I would recommend to do differently, and one of the things is I would say keep an eye out for red flags. If you see someone endorsing Alex Jones as insightful, that's a red flag. It doesn't mean everything that they've said is now useless, but there's something there. If you see somebody behaving like an unhinged lunatic on Twitter, unless it's me, then adjust your consideration about how well they might be applying their philosophy, if they're claiming wisdom and so on. So yeah, I think just in some sense it's a kind of boring point that like a lot of the things that are worth doing and helpful in that regard are not that exciting. They're things like learning media literacy or basic statistical competence and so on, and that just that we all need to be like careful that we don't get kind of pulled away whenever we find a topic exciting and intellectually stimulating. Like you should still pull on the reins a little bit to ask critical questions. So I don't know how that was for reflections, but that's all I have. So I'll hand to John.
Thank you, Chris. I enjoyed tonight more than I expected to, and I'm very grateful for Chris and Matt for that. I'm always grateful for whatever Christopher does because of his natural lyricism and his profound friendship. But both of you showed up in good faith. I tried my best to reciprocate in kind. I think there was good give and take. I think we often were exemplifying better than we were speaking about what we were trying to point to. I thought that was good. I like it when people are not only talking about virtues and normativity, because I think that's what we are talking about here, but when they also exemplify it. I think that's important to recognize. So I'm grateful for that. And this is and I'm actually actively talking with people right now. This issue about threading the needle about talking to people. There's two possibilities. Like we could do guilt by association, which is ridiculous and horrible and leads to social contagion and all kinds of bad things. Or well, you talk to them, so you must endorse everything they say, and that's problematic. But on the other hand, and I didn't disagree because I agree with Chris and Matt but there needs to be proper pushback. But I think with social media and parasocial relations, like Peter was pointing to, there's an additional eye of the needle that needs to be threaded here. And I'm not quite clear about how do we do, because the problem with these is this, for example, breaks the boundary between public and private, between writing and spontaneous discourse, because it has a permanency to it, and people will take Chris, you talked about media literacy, but I think there's kind of an emerging media literacy that needs to be addressed here about how do we create a proper cultural etiquette around this. I like the way it happened here. I like the way it worked here. I liked it a lot. But I guess what's now provoked me right now immediately is how do we thread this needle so that we talk to each other with enough regard and connection so that critique can get a purchase? And how do we do that without being seen to be completely endorsing somebody? I get it. I won't talk to people that don't show up in good faith, but I'm left with a question. So I'm left with two things. And like I said, I'm grateful for the way Chris and Matt showed up, and that's not Canadian flattery. I really am. This went better than I thought it was going to. And then like I said, I'm sort of left with a question that was already forming, but this really sort of exacerbated the question for me, which is, how do we thread this needle? How do we get this balance between canceling and guilt by association, and then on one hand, and on the other hand, proper engagement, proper critique, and proper willingness to also co-create, co-construct. For me, that's become a prominent question, and I'll pass it to Matt.
Thanks, John. And just to echo your sentiments there, I also came to this somewhat reluctantly. Chris twisted my arm, but I enjoyed it more than I thought I would. Good to meet you both, and I think you're right. It was good because we're talking and we're actually listening to each other, and it's not necessary to agree 100%. I think my final thought is like Chris, just to reply to that question, like that nice concrete question, which was, okay, team criticism, what do you think we on Team Wisdom should do differently, specifically? All right, what's the advice? I got a couple of heuristics of my own that I'll share, and I don't think you can do much better than heuristics with this kind of thing. Firstly, I think it would be great, and this was something that one of the reasons I've got a bit of an issue with the notion of wisdom or any other sort of global sort of virtue words, because what they do is they kind of encourage us to look to a single person with a singular quality who's our oracle and our go-to person. And we see now in social media that many of the people that Chris and I cover, they've got an opinion on everything. All right. You want to know about what we should do in Ukraine? They've got an opinion on that. What about vaccines? They can tell you about that. There's nothing that they can't tell you because they've got maybe wisdom or some other virtue we ascribe to them. Now, I personally, genuinely do not do that. And I would advise everybody not to do that. I'm not saying pick a different guru or a different voice. Just don't do that. Go to specialists. I listen to some excellent foreign affairs podcasts, some excellent analyses from various people who work in foreign relations and things like that. That's where I get that. When I want to do a deep dive on Ukraine, I go there. If I'm interested in virology, I talk to virologists. Chris has put me on to This Week in Virology. There's heaps of great specialists in that area. So I think, that's my first tip. We don't need to go to some circle of wise men for insights on everything. Maybe when it comes to living our lives and general kind of philosophy and so on, maybe. So sorry, that was not a final. I did not mean that as a final dict in the argument at all. I just meant it as literally a practical thing that I do. I just want to thank you guys for having a chat with us. I really want to emphasize, we come, I think, from different sort of perspectives, even though there's a lot of overlap in psychology and other areas, cognitive science that we're all interested in. There's definitely different kind of epistemic ways of approaching it. So we just have to recognize it's always going to be difficult for you guys to talk to us guys. And, that's okay. My sadly deceased mum's partner just an absolutely lovely guy. He was into a lot of, spiritual, religious, philosophical concepts with neologisms and very complicated words and stuff. We would have a whiskey together, and I had no idea what he was talking about, and he had no idea what I was talking about. But a lovely guy, and that's okay to be coming from different places.
Yeah, I would say as you all did, I really appreciated this. This was a really good discussion, and Chris and Matt, it was really a pleasure to meet you both. And I take what you just said, Matt, really seriously about knowing the limits of your own. Know your limits, know where your ignorance begins, or at least have some idea of where it begins. And developing a relationship with that boundary seems to be key to all of this. And knowing that you're coming from a particular context with a particular temperament, that we're all coming in with a set of constraints that give us, that we're all coming in with one hand tied behind our back somehow. And knowing that is a good place to start. And just the injunction for a bit of Socratic self-scrutiny, especially when it comes to that temperamental constraint. Some of us are more disagreeable, some of us are more agreeable. If you're more disagreeable, it's going to be far easier to level a criticism. And if you're more agreeable, it's going to come natural to you to yes and an argument, but it's going to take a lot more courage to be more incisive. And that's something I take seriously too, because I have to remind myself, I have to sometimes remind myself to work against my own temperament, knowing that it's going to lapse me into patterns that are going to sometimes not be suitable for the situation. So Chris, I take that point seriously too. This idea that, it's not, you have to be willing to go in and with a point at the end of your instrument sometimes, because sometimes that's actually what's called for. So anyway, yeah, I think it's hard to prescribe that. It's hard to generalize it. It's just sort of a reminder for each of us, that kind of reflexive side of things. Know what you're coming in with, and know that this is an opportunity to learn. So maybe I'll stop there. And thanks to you, Peter.
So thank you, Christopher, and thank you, gentlemen. It's good seeing Chris, John, and Christopher back at the STOA, and Matt. It's good to have you here. I hope to have you all back again soon for another potentially awkward and surprisingly enjoyable conversation. And there's no events coming up at the STOA. The STOA's birthday is on the 21st, March 21st. So season 4 begins, and some announcements will be coming then. So you can check out the stoa.ca. So that being said, everyone, thank you so much for coming to the STOA today.
Thank you, Peter.